Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over super common production mistakes that you can make that could harm your projects and how to fix them. Now this is going to be in no particular order, this is just something I've noticed a lot of people when they're starting off producing might make these mistakes. So I wanted to make this video, show you guys like solutions to these problems, and with that being said, let's go ahead and get straight into it here. Now the first thing that I want to talk about, number one in this video, is going to be not editing your velocity if you have a piano. Now, I put together kind of a demo project here where I've purposely made these mistakes as well so I could demonstrate what it sounds like before and after. But looking at this piano here, you see every note is hitting at the same exact velocity, which sounds like this. Now, this is not a realistic sound because of that. Obviously, if you're, real sitting in front of a piano and you're playing it, you're not going to hit every key at the exact same velocity. The best way to get this super realistic is if you have a MIDI keyboard, you could just record in the MIDI, then of course correct mistakes that way and adjust your velocity. But if you don't want to do that, you could also select what notes you want to change and just kind of draw on something randomly. There's also a randomizer for this, but I prefer doing it by hand. Have this hit differently depending on what note you're hitting, and you'll get a much cooler result. You see, you could do it like this, have it very soft, or louder like this, and depending on the piano you're using, that could be really expressive and make things sound a lot cooler. Now, coming in at number two, this is going to relate to EQing your different sounds correctly. Now, this mix I have right now, as I say, I made these mistakes on purpose so I could demonstrate fixing them. You're going to notice there's some problems with the sub and bass information because there is a lot of overlap. So to demonstrate, I'm going to play the project here. So what I mean by this overlap, there's the sub bass right here, and this is a very good sound. It's taking up a lot of the sub and low mid bass region, and that is perfect on its own. That doesn't really need anything changed. But what you're also going to notice is other elements in the song, so the piano here has a lot of bass information like that. So does this sound, the saw stack I made, and all of that, if you say pull it up on an EQ for example, is conflicting with the region where that bass is going to sit. So it means if you put on an EQ on, say, the master channel and just listen to the lows on this track, you'll be able to hear this very clearly. Like this region over here. There's no definition. This sounds really bad because there's a lot of stuff happening in that region instead of, say, just a sub bass that's nice and powerful. You could see it, but there's also that conflict from the saws and the pianos. So that brings me to my point here, of course, being you need to EQ out sections so that way they're not fighting with one another. So this piano, obviously on its own, that sounds perfectly fine, but we know that there's going to be a bass in the mix doing that job instead, so we actually don't need anything like around here, for example. It'll sound a bit thinner when we listen to it, because we're getting rid of all this, but it doesn't need to be there. Another very common mistake, though, that kind of goes in hand with this, is don't do too much of this. If you make your sounds too thin, like here, that will not sound good even if you have a bass underneath it in the mix. You don't want to cut too much, you still want that warmth. This is a super important region, you don't want to completely get rid of it, but you do want to clean it up. So I'm also going to clean the saws, which I think sound really nice on their own, but we don't want to have that conflict with the bass, so we're going to cut to about, say, there. And that will remove all of this noise, which, as I say, is just conflicting with it. It just sounds bad when you overlap it on top of one another, and that alone will have cleaned up this track very nicely. Perfect. Now, this next one is exclusive to FL Studio because it's about an FL stock plugin specifically, but this can apply if you're using additional stock plugins that maybe have the same issue. You see here on this project I'm using Ozone on my master, but FL does have Fruity Limiter built in. This is a free stock plugin you could use. But to be honest with you, though I really like this plugin for certain uses such as sidechain, I do not think it's a good limiter. It has a very specific sound, and if you use this on your masters for limiting, you might notice it sounds excessively pushed. I'm going to try to demonstrate that here. Keeping this at the same exact setting as my Ozone, but, disabling it so you hear it with the limiter. That versus this. Now, it's really hard to train your ear to notice the exact difference, especially if you're just starting out. but I noticed specifically on the drums, they get really squashed and sound very, very bad. I do not like how Fruity Limiter handles these kind of things. I'm going to try to demonstrate it even better just to make it abundantly clear. So, you could hear it if I lower the ceiling. Obviously, this is an incredibly exaggerated example, and it makes it over-compressed. But it does have that very specific tone to it, which I do not like really at all. And a common use for Fruity Limiter, even if you're not using it for limiting, is for sidechain. But another very common mistake is you're not adjusting your ceiling knob. If you're using this for sidechain, you know, you're using the gate controls over here, you don't want the limiter to actually be doing anything. You want to raise your ceiling like this, so whatever sounds you're using, especially if they're running in hot to this volume-wise, aren't actually being hit by that and then being limited, so that way you could avoid that happening. This way, if you're using this for sidechain, it doesn't do any of that limiting, and you get a completely clean signal to sidechain with, because you don't want the tone of Fruity Limiter on there. I notice a lot of people when they're starting out, I can genuinely tell they've used Fruity Limiter on their master without them telling me, because the sound it has is very specific. If you don't want to spend the money for something like Pro MB for sidechain or Pro L for mastering or even Ozone, you can use Clip Shifter, which is free, or if you have FL specifically, you could use a plugin called Maximus built in. It does have a lot of control that you can't necessarily get with this, and you could get a much cleaner result that I would recommend 10 times over using Fruity Limiter. Another point I want to talk about, we'll also go back to this bass sound for this. A lot of times, if you're starting off producing, you might have very muddy sides. Now, what that means, for example, if I take a new patch to kind of demonstrate this, we'll just make it a sine wave, and we're going to up the unison, and this is going to play sub. This is intentional, it will sound kind of bad, but let's just go ahead and solo that and put in a note. Here we go. So something like this. This might be hard to hear, so I'm actually going to draw in a couple more harmonics. Just this. So if we put this on a mixer channel and listen to the side information, some devices might not be able to hear this just if the device is in mono. But you see, we have sub all over our sides, and you could see it's kind of hopping around everywhere because there's phase cancellation. And this won't translate too well. Say, for example, if we sum this to mono, we have a very unstable bass that's hopping everywhere, like volume-wise. It's going all sorts of different places. That's not good. Stereo is super important, but you have to be very careful and you want to control it if you're doing it on your low-end information. So a good way to handle that, actually, you'll see in this bass patch I'm using for the song, I do have a pure sine wave that's one voice of unison, so it's completely mono. And that gives us our nice controlled actual sub bass. And then I do have this other one over here, which is 10 voices, but you'll notice if you go into it, there's no actual fundamental. There's no sub here, it's just actual bass above it. And that gives us nice controlled low end. That means it's completely stable, it's like flat in volume, but you still have the excitement of upper harmonics that you otherwise wouldn't get from a sine wave. That's a little bit more advanced, I realize, for this video, but it's something super important to learn early, because bass is super important. It'll make your track sound a lot better. And that reminds me, while we're talking about side information, I want to demonstrate a common technique that people will do kind of incorrectly here, revolving dimension expander. Now, if you don't know what dimension expander is, I'll demonstrate kind of what that sounds like so you can hear it. We're going to put it on this, so listen before and after. So you never want to crank it this much, but that's just to demonstrate what it does. It expands the stereo field a bit, it makes it more exciting that way. And this is a great plugin, it's free, you should definitely get it, but something I want to demonstrate with this that you might not know is that this effect completely disappears in mono. So you don't want to use this to carry like the sound design of an element, you don't want to make it wide solely with this, because if you go back to mono, everything you're adding with this is going to completely disappear. So to demonstrate that, let's make it mono now. You see, it's gone. You can compare this to like reverb here, for example, in terms of what it sounds like, but reverb won't fully disappear. This will. But as I say, it's still really important. You're definitely going to want this plugin. That's just something you need to know. So that way you don't accidentally have something sound completely different when you're listening in stereo versus mono. Up next, I'm going to talk about poor bass translation. What I mean by this is, say you have a song that you've produced and you have your bass line. If you haven't done sound design a certain way, your bass might actually disappear on devices that can't really output something like that. So you remember earlier in this video when I had that pure sine wave to demonstrate bass? That only exists in one space, and it's super low. It's below 100 Hertz if you're looking at an EQ. And stuff like that is going to be really hard to show up on, say, like a phone or something like that. You'll notice on this bass sound, when I unmute it, there's a lot happening. Instead of just having it exist here in this one space following like sine wave, there's all this information up here, for example. You could really hear it like that. Just like mid-bass, it goes up really high. It's honestly, to a degree, full spectrum. It's very quiet down here, but it does exist. And that is really good. That means when you listen to this on phone speakers, even if you can't hear the actual sub-bass, you're going to still be able to hear the bass. If you didn't have this, and it was just sine like that, this is going to be really hard to hear on anything. But if you turn it back on, you're good. And if you have a bass and you want it to be more audible on different devices, I recommend using a saturation plugin. I have FabFilter Saturn 2. If you take, say for example, regions like here, and up the drive with warm tape or something like that, you get this distortion, but that's good because it means this bass will now be able to be heard easily on devices that can't properly output it normally. That's something that you'll just get a feel for over time and be able to make better sounds that translate well. But you will want to keep that in mind because you're not going to want to make a song that people can't hear the bass to on mobile. And that again leads to another very good point. If you're making music and starting off, you need to be listening to your songs on as many devices as you can. If I didn't know about, say, making my basses, like sound designing them a bit differently so they're able to be heard on mobile, then I'd think they sounded fine because I have a system that's capable of outputting stuff like that, whether it be my speakers or my headphones. But average listeners might not. They might be listening to your song on, I don't know, AirPods, their phone speakers, something like that. And you want to listen to it on all these things so you could design it appropriately. Maybe you hear something sticking out in the mix that you otherwise wouldn't have had a problem with. You want to listen to it on as many devices as you can. Bring it into, say, your car speakers, listen on your phone, listen on your TV, everything, in addition to your speakers and your headphones. Every device has a different sound profile, and you might notice things stick out and sound harsh on one device that don't on another. So you want to try to fix that in a way, so that way it sounds as good as it possibly can on every device. And my last point for this video is going to be how to layer drums in a way that don't clash, in particular with snares. So I do have a couple of drum hits here that I've put into this track. There's this main one, which I use the kick and snare from. But I also have this layer. And the snare, if we open up the EQ, you see I have this very sharp EQ at like 203. If I take that off, you're going to notice, if I put on another just so you can see it by the way, the snare is hitting right here. If I boost it, you'll hear it very clearly. Occasionally, you'll have snare fundamentals, if you're layering, conflict with one another, and sometimes it could sound fine. In this instance, it didn't. And what you want to do is take the one that's not the main hit that you just want like extra energy from on like the tops, and you can use a very narrow EQ like this. I just scoop out where the fundamental is, so you can see I have it boosted now, and then just turn down the gain, completely cut it. And this means it'll layer. If there's a fundamental on a different snare, that could hit in its place, and you still have the tone. And also, because I have kicks, I can cut out all this low information, because you just don't need it. And you see now, this looks exactly like my other EQ. That's literally just what I did. And we're set. So now when I listen to all my drums all together, you're going to notice they fit really well and sound good with one another. And it's that easy. So this is meant to be like a part 1 type video. I want to maybe make a part 2, so let me know in the comments if you have additional production mistakes that you'd like to see covered. But now, if we listen to the track, you could hear, just with like the EQ differences alone, it's going to sound a lot cleaner than it previously did. So let's go ahead and run this through in full, and that's going to wrap up this video. If you enjoyed, drop a like and subscribe for more production content, and I'll see you in the next one.